We're starting our assignment desk version of this afternoon, and in this section, which we think is critical, we're going to be talking about stories that have broken news, stories that still need to be done, and resources for journalists anywhere who can get them from this program or collect it, as we will be doing, on our site. And the person organizing this organizing that for us is uniquely qualified to do it. It's Karen Testa. Karen, for the better part of the past year for the Associated Press, has commissioned coverage, has been the supervisor of coverage of sexual harassment. And Karen, we brought you in for this purpose. What advice do you have right now for newsrooms who know that there are stories to be done and want to do them right?
I think I would say, don't go looking for a bad guy to take down. Don't go looking for a big name. Understand that so much of what we can do is proactive journalism, understanding what are the regulations out there that exist, who has set things in place, what is the culture in almost any beat that we cover. It's really hard to think of any beat that we cover where there wouldn't be some intersectionality with looking at issues of harassment.
Give us an idea of some of those stories that you've seen and that you actually edited.
Sure. I mean, there are stories as small as in state houses. I love thinking back to Maine. We discovered that there had not been one complaint of harassment made in the state house in Augusta. It's not that Mainers are just so lovely. It's just that there was no mechanism to make that complaint. So those types of stories, just finding out what are the rules of the road, what exists, how can people come forward if there are going to be issues, and that just gives good accountability.
So many times it isn't, as you say, about chasing one person. It could be about a system that doesn't work.
Absolutely. It could be a system in your symphony orchestra. It could be a system in your youth sports program. It could be a system on your city council. There are any number of places wherever there is power, wherever there is a lack of diversity, wherever there is a system in place, where it's just a good idea just to take an extra look.
So we have you here where you're happiest, playing editor, and tell us exactly what you're going to be doing.
We already, with my partner Lisa here, we have been scratching down every time the word resource has been mentioned, every time somebody says, oh, there's a great something or other, and we're compiling all of that. We will put it onto a website tagged to the assignment desk where people will be able to see any number of databases, good people to talk to, and other resources that are out there just to help the reporting when you go home.
Okay. And to help in that effort, we also have cards at every desk, every table here, for people who may not want to stand up and shout, but they have an idea and they want to bring it forward. So we have a couple of things we're going to talk about. Stories that have been done to give us an idea of best practices and how to do it right. But also a request from people in the room for just an idea that you say is a story that you'd love to see covered, an idea you think should be developed. So that takes us to our conversation leaders to start this off. And I want to start with Aminda Marqués from the Miami Herald, and I want to make sure that you get credit for flying all the way in against all the travel issues that you might have faced. Talk to us about breaking the Epstein story and what it took. And we know that your star reporter is right here, and we're not going to let her escape attention.
So, in reality, Julie actually started looking at this case before the Me Too movement, actually became a movement. She had done incredible work on abuses at a women's correctional facility in Florida, and at the heart of that, a lot of it was about the sexual traffic and sexual trade, and so she wanted to look at that as her next project. And every time she would tell you, every time she would Google, sex trafficking in Florida, well, the top of the name was Jeffrey Epstein, and the case was about 10 years old, and then then right at that moment, Acosta, who had handled that case, was actually nominated to be be in President Trump's cabinet. And we did a fairly quick turnaround story that highlighted how this story was this case was mishandled from the beginning. But Julie really felt there was more to do there. And I have to say, when Julie first came to talk to me about the story, this has been mined so deeply that I wasn't really sure. I said, Julie, what more can we really do here? Because so much has been written about this over, the last 10 years. And Julie said very emphatically, nobody's ever talked to the victims. Nobody's talked to them. Nobody's heard from them. They were shut out of this process, and we've never gone back. And the work that she did to find out who those now women, but really young, teenagers, some of them still wearing braces, were, and to compile a name of 60 women was really extraordinary. And she was able to reach out to about 60 of 80 ultimately victims that were identified and get more than half a dozen to talk to us. So, and then she was doing all this work, and then the Me Too, Me Too movement broke out with this extraordinary reporting that fall. But we were able to really, I think, coming at it from the perspective of what is the story of the victims that nobody's ever heard, gave this such a different perspective, and also how did this go so wrong, and how was this able to happen? Which, again, so much had been written, but I think nobody took that 30,000 foot, and plus Julie brought tons of new material to bear by digging and digging and digging.
Well, since I have Julie, who's next to Julie Brown, let's ask you two things. One, this is also a story about power. There's no question, and triggered, of course, by someone's nomination, to a higher position in government, but also the conversation with victims. So we want your wisdom, not just how you did it, but what advice you have for all the journalists who are paying attention, who want to look at systemic power abuses and also want to find a way to talk with victims that doesn't cause harm in the process.
Well, you have to gain their trust. You don't do it overnight. I mean, that's part of the reason why this project took so long. There were a lot of people I went to initially that didn't want to talk at all. They never, a lot of these women never told anybody that they were. This was, for those who don't know, this was a multimillionaire hedge fund manager from New York who owned homes all over the world, really, and he owns a home in Palm Beach. And for years he had been molesting very young girls. And the police found out about it. He had the means to hire some of the most powerful well-known lawyers in the world, Alan Dershowitz, Kenneth Starr, Roy Black, and he managed to use his money and his power to manipulate the criminal justice system. And that's another whole part of the story is how he did that, which he essentially got the prosecutors, among them the state attorney and the U.S. attorney, Alex Acosta, who is now the Secretary of Labor, to essentially work with his attorneys hand in hand to conceal the scope of this man's crimes and to treat these girls as if they were not victims. They were essentially treated as prostitutes because the whole way he lured them, they were poor girls who came from very troubled families, had no money, and he said, the lure that he used was just come give an old man essentially a massage, and it wasn't a massage at all. So, but somehow he and his attorneys managed to convince the prosecutors that these weren't victims. They were prostitutes. They were child prostitutes. And so these girls, when I first approached them, did not want to talk to me because even though there had been tons of media coverage about this story, it had been, in their minds, it had been covered from a sensationalized point of view where all anybody really wanted to read was, sex, and these were famous people, and Clinton was on his plane, Epstein's plane, and in their point of view, and also in the point of view of the police chief who had never been interviewed before and the lead detective, no one really wanted to look at exactly what went wrong and how it went wrong. And these girls felt betrayed. And it took me a long time to convince them that I wasn't going to write the story that had been written before. I wanted to write the story about how these prosecutors didn't do their job. And it took me, you just keep talking to them. And then based on the questions that you ask them, they sort of finally realize, I really think she's really going to do, she's going to tell my story, and I think that that's really what maybe helped with this project.
I'm fascinated by your point that the framing of that situation of these young women as child prostitutes rather than victims was also a systemic issue. It was their ability to manipulate a system. But can I just ask you how many women were involved in any of those prosecutions and any of that framing?
It's an interesting question because with the last panel I noted, Mizell had mentioned, or a couple of the panelists had mentioned something about how when they were trying to get together employers or discussions about this kind of institutionalized problem, they brought in lawyers for the employees and lawyers for the employers, and I kept thinking to myself, most of the lawyers involved in the case that I wrote about, they were part of the problem. And and also the media. Quite frankly, I don't want to name any names. Everybody does the best that they could, but the media back then, this was 10 years ago, did not cover that story like we look at it today. In their defense, it just wasn't something that they looked at. They were very cagey about how they wrote about the story.
Hold your mic close.
Sorry.
Okay, good.
They were
We don't want
very
to miss a word.
Not used to talking like this, but they were very cagey about how they covered it. They were afraid of being sued. There were some very powerful lawyers involved in this case, and the lawyers were shrewd in that they used the media in the right way. They tried to discredit these girls, say they were liars. They took their social media pages where they were, smoking pot and drinking and saying, look, these girls are trash, basically. And the detective, to his credit, and the police chief were saying, it doesn't matter what they were doing. They were molested, But back then, it was really looked at a different way, I think, by all people involved.
So you may be a living example of the power shift, and this was
Right.
the right time in this moment to be
Right.
able to reopen that story and revisit it with new information.
I also don't think it would have gotten the attention that it got if it wasn't for other reporters who, when I first, pitched the story before the Me Too movement, of course there was, they thought it would be a good story, my editor. But when the Me Too movement happened, they're like, hey, let's get this story out there. This is great timing. So I was, I did benefit from the timing.
So speaking of those other reporters, that takes us to Jane Mayer of the New Yorker, and whose work over many years has been remarkable for all of us. But your work most recently, especially most recently in the Kavanaugh hearings, what do you feel the lessons are, especially from talking to a witness who was terrified to come forward?
Well,
explain the backstory a little bit, if you would.
okay. In the nomination of Supreme Court Justice now, Brett Kavanaugh, obviously Christine Blasey Ford had come forward to describe what had happened to her in high school. And when that happened, we at the New Yorker started to hear from other women with other experiences that were in some ways similar. And I think, and began to sort of walk them towards being able to tell their stories. It was a hard negotiation in many ways, and I think stepping back, one of the things that you've said earlier is that it's about power, and this requires often people who have almost no power to confront some of the most powerful people in our country, whether it's somebody who's about to join the Supreme Court, or somebody at the top of the movie industry, or the Attorney General of New York State. I mean, these are terrifying targets for these victims to speak out about. And so one of the things that you're going to face from the very start is the need to try to convince people to step up and tell their stories. And I think in doing that, you talked about winning their trust. I think you also have to take extraordinary care to protect them and make sure you're not walking them off a plank, because they can be in tremendous trouble if things go wrong for them. And so in the case of the Eric Schneiderman story that Ronan Farrow and I did, we had heard of one woman who was willing to speak up about what was basically, in her mind, sexual assault at his hands. And my initial thought, having covered the Anita Hill hearings, was we need a pattern. To protect this woman, we need more than one. If it's one person, it's their word against somebody else's word. Credibility is the thing that all of these stories depend on. The accusers have to be believable, and usually there are no witnesses. So we started a search to see if there were other women who had the same experience, and lo and behold, it only took a matter of weeks before we had a handful of women with the same experience, because frequently there are these sort of patterns of behavior. And in the case of Brett Kavanaugh, I mean, it was both these men were really terrifying for the women to speak out about. But Brett Kavanaugh, you know, I mean, it wasn't just the women themselves who were confronting him. It was the lawyers in the law firms representing him. It was a complete power structure in the legal world. Law firms didn't want to have anything to do with being associated with the women who were going to challenge him. There were people who were just fleeing from these women, and it was really hard to give them the support and the confidence they needed to come forward. I have to hand it to Ronan, my partner in crime on this. Ronan Farrow is really good at hand-holding, much better than I am, I have to say. I'm better at like sticking it to the guys in power, but he really knew how to make people feel that we were going to take care of them and we were serious, and that was a big part of getting them to come forward. And then making sure the story was right and that it was truthful, and checking it in every which way, and confronting the people and giving them a chance to respond, and being responsible reporters. And anyway, it was an incredibly emotional experience as a reporter. It was obviously emotional for the women. It was in both those stories, they were It was a very sort of heightened emotional experience telling those stories, and in the Kavanaugh one, it was exhausting, and then there was the FBI was supposedly getting in and checking the stories to see if they were true. Then they didn't really look into anything, and it all seemed to be quite a fake out. And then of course, there were hearings that were not really looking for the truth. It had a kind of a deja vu feeling to anybody who'd covered Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas. So
let me just call on Laura Bergthold, who wants to talk about people who've been traumatized in trauma-informed reporting and knows a little bit about this story too.
Hi, I am a partner at a communications firm in Los Angeles and have been on all sides of this issue this year. Worked with Time's Up for 8 months. And at the end of the year, CBS hired me to give away the Les Moonves money, we like to call it. And I was thrilled to hear all the examples of how that money is being put to good use in this room. But in the middle of that, sandwiched in between, I got a call from Ricky Seidman, a longtime friend who'd been working with Christine Ford. Would I go help Debbie Ramirez, who, it was Sunday night, the New Yorker story came out. Monday morning, I was in Boulder. And really the first thing she said to me when I met her was, the only person I trust is Ronan and you. But Ronan was...
He was the one speaking with her, yeah.
For her, the only person in this insane world that she trusted. And I'm still working with Debbie, and there are now many books coming out and documentaries, and it's going to be an interesting process. But what I learned from her, and I've worked a lot with survivors and victims on various subjects, but specifically in this case, was the number of reporters. I mean, it was that white hot glare. There was a stakeout. I was able to then call those news outlets and say, really, the stakeout is not helpful. You're not going to get any coverage. And what it's just causing her to do is hide out in her house, which is not helping anybody, certainly not helping her. And over time, we were able to, there was eventually one camera in front of her house, and we were able to get her out of the house, and that was incredibly helpful for her mental health. But there were a couple of reporters who came to me who very clearly had trauma-informed training, and I think Poynter Institute does it. You guys might do some. They approached the discussion with her very differently from other reporters. It was not, what can I get? Can I get her on air to tell the very difficult details of her story, which wasn't helpful, had been reported in the New Yorker. And so for every journalist who came forward to her, she didn't want to do that. She wanted to talk about why, sort of what her background had been, why she came forward, why she was coming forward on behalf of survivors. She'd worked with a lot of domestic violence survivors, and that was less of an interest in the story. The story was, can I get her on air telling the sordid details about her experience with Kavanaugh? The trauma-informed reporters and producers really had a different, they sent a letter, there was just a different approach to the conversation, and I really would encourage people, I think, when you put your reporters through that kind of training, and I've now worked with some reporters and said to them, there's this training, and if you go look at that.
Yeah, the Dart Center as well does good work there.
You can come back into it. There, Debbie's issues had to do with memory gaps. When you've had trauma-informed training, you understand those memory gaps differently, and so you can approach that victim with an understanding of why they're having those memory gaps. It just really helped open the doors for her and for her ability to now be talking to these reporters who are writing these books. And I do think that that's a really valuable component of this work, and that more newsrooms should be really looking into doing that.
And trauma-informed reporting also helps you avoid the pitfalls of judging people's affect. Are they angry? Are they not angry? And that takes me to Soraya, who has written the book, Rage Becomes Her, The Power of Women's Anger. And I have one of the quotes from your book, we are so busy teaching girls to be likable that we often forget how to teach them to do, as we do boys, that they should be respected. And so if the woman is angry, that could be a problem. If she isn't angry enough, that could be a problem. And how reporters interpret that, even in framing a story, could make such a difference. We tend to think of victims as being maybe quiet and afraid to speak. They come in all responses.
Yeah, we see the same biases in journalism that appear in the courtroom. And I think it's really important to understand why the trauma-informed reporting structure is so valuable. The Women's Media Center does studies every year, and one of, I think, the most important was a study of the coverage of campus sexual assault stories. And what came out of that I think is important, particularly given what we've heard about the approaches that all of these stories have taken, was that a very disproportionate number of stories were being written by men in sports departments. And that's because so many high-profile cases involve athletes. But men in sports departments generally don't come to stories of rape from the perspective of trauma. And the study also showed that there are certain aspects of having this hegemonically masculine environment in the way the stories are framed and told, the words that are chosen, the sources that are chosen. And so, roughly 90% of sports stories are still written by men. And when they write about sexual assault, for example, they tend to focus on the legal issues. And we know that the legal system egregiously fails victims over and over and over again. They tend to focus on a he said, she said framing, which is very traditional in journalism, but again, actually is very unhelpful in situations where there are imbalances of credibility based on gender. And so being able to actually have people on staff that have studied sexual violence or understand the difference between sexual violence and harassment and gender harassment, because I think we conflate those two things, and it's important to make that distinction. A lot of what women experience writing about these topics is in fact not sexual harassment, but gender harassment, which is a confrontation of status. When we write, I write extensively about sexual violence, and sexual violence is one of the #1 catalysts for online harassment. Sexual violence, writing about feminism or social justice. These are direct confrontations to power structures, and studies have shown that stories about these things tend to generate a lot more online abuse. But that's not actually sexual harassment online. It is a form of intersectional gender harassment, because there's just a lot about sexual violence that implicates power. That's what we're talking about. And so writing about it elicits a strong status threat. The thing about the status threat is that it's also very evident in our newsrooms. And I think that we can't really talk about sources or who's writing stories if we're not talking about the structures of our media corporations. And if you think back to the Rolling Stone story and the debunking of that story, it gives a pretty pitch-perfect example, because that story started off with framing that is known not to be good for sexual violence stories. It was a very salacious, very extreme story. It wasn't really emblematic of the type of average rape story. People who chose to write about it and ultimately wrote about it didn't understand the neurobiological effects of trauma. So holes in her memory, for example, weren't well understood. And then the breakdown of what failed also followed pretty bad policies about covering sexual violence. And so in the end, even though everybody involved acknowledged that this victim had suffered some terrible violence, the story ended up being a second Duke, a lying bitch story. And it was much more extensively covered as that than it had been as a critique of an institutional response to sexual violence, which is what it tried to be. And I think that a big problem, certainly as a writer I've experienced this, a big problem is that our very senior editorial spaces are systems justifying. And they're systems justifying in a way that protects fraternity. And it's not only the fraternity in media, but again, as is the case with any of the cases we've talked about, overlapping systems of fraternity. So there's the legal system, and there's the media system, and there's the tech world. And it's in the spaces where they overlap that the powerless are particularly powerless. And so I think that even something as simple as thinking, well, what does the perfect victim look like, is far more complicated than representation or who's writing the story, because it speaks to a deep knowledge of experience.
And no better evidence of that would come from the coverage of the Larry Nassar story, which we have one of the key reporters who brought that to life from a smaller newspaper than the Miami Herald, but this is Marissa Kwiatkowski. And give us your thoughts on, first of all, a little background on what you did, and then the lessons for the people in the room.
Sure. So my colleagues and I investigated USA Gymnastics and their handling of sexual abuse allegations. And we also were the ones who broke the Larry Nassar investigation as well. And you've heard it a lot in this conversation today, talking about systems and how systems work and how systems can fail. We heard that with what Julie was talking about earlier, as well as others. And from what I've seen in my investigations, looking at sexual abuse in schools, looking at sexual abuse in gymnastics and other entities, is that it's common, right? There's what should you do, what's the right thing to do, what does the law require? And what I've seen over and over again is that these systems, they fail, and sometimes they fail for good reasons, whether it's because they like the person has a good reputation, they think it's somebody who's good, or it's because they don't believe it could be true, or they try and discredit the survivors who are coming forward. And over again, these systems fail, and it's not just a USA Gymnastics problem, it's not a court problem, it's not a police problem, it's a community problem, it's a pervasive problem. And creating an environment for people where they can just be comfortable sharing their stories is, I think, the first step to creating change.
And talk a little bit about some of the barriers that you faced, especially, you're not a tremendously well-funded organization. You don't have a great budget to go do a lot of travel, have a lot of attorneys. How did you handle it within the budget you had?
Well, that's a media challenge, isn't it? We had bosses who were incredibly supportive of the work that we were doing and believed in the importance of giving survivors a voice and looking at, again, not these individual cases, which is what happens a lot of times, is you write the story about the person who was charged and the outcome of that case, but you don't look at the system that enabled this person for 20 years to make this happen. And so We were lucky to have people who supported that and who allowed us to look at the bigger system. And again, it was just one system. There are a lot of different systems and a lot of failures of systems. And we did that by making a lot of phone calls. We did that by being very judicious in when we needed to fly somewhere or get access to documents. And again, but the support goes a long way.
And I guess that takes me back to Mindy. I mean, Julie, you had to get up in the morning knowing that you had an editor who had your back. And I can imagine that there were fights that you don't even know about that Mindy had to go through. That's how good editors usually operate. Mindy, what did you do from the managerial standpoint to make sure that you were always running interference, including prosecuting the story, obviously?
So I think that one thing is that I obviously there's an investigative editor between Julie and I, but I think that we have a relationship where, number one, there was a point where Julie felt she needed to come into my office and make sure that I understood the story that she was trying to pursue, that we had the conversation, because I wanted to make sure that it was a story that was going to be different and that we were going to be able to differentiate what had been done. And I remember her saying to me, I want to make sure you read this because I need a woman's perspective on it. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that while Julie worked very closely with the investigative editor, Casey Frank, we kept touching base along the way, and I think that was, and I in fact did read every draft that Julie worked on, and we just have been committed to this kind of work. It's a big commitment because Julie is an amazing reporter, and when we have breaking news, which we had a lot of this year, the Parkland shooting and a bridge collapse. Just to name a couple of things, she's exactly the kind of person that you want to throw into the fray. But we had to use her judiciously, knowing that she needed to work on that. And the other conversation that we had, which I don't think I've ever had this kind of conversation, because you never feel like you're going to be bullied by to a certain extent, but you feel like you can swat them off. But Julie came in and said, I have sources who are refusing to talk to me because they do not believe that the Miami Herald is going to ever run this story, because he had been so successful in quashing the whole proceedings and cutting out the victims. And so getting an assurance from me that she could take back to her sources that we are indeed going to publish this story, I hope helped Julie get two very reluctant but absolutely critical law enforcement sources to talk to her.
And you're not done.
And we're not done. Yeah, we're fighting in court in New York to unseal some records. There's a lot of information that has not come forth because a lot of the documents, a lot of the civil cases have been sealed involving the Epstein case, and so we're actually right now trying to unseal a case in New York, and I'm sure.
And by the way, that's a big problem.
Here, take this, please.
I just wanted to point out that's a big problem with these kinds of cases, with all these victims, when they do get the courage.
Just talk to that camera.
Sorry.
The world can see.
When they do get the courage to finally maybe go public with this or to sue whoever it is that sexually assaulted them, then what happens is everything is sealed in the case. So, and then it's settled. And that's what happened in this. We had dozens and dozens of girls who were molested by this man, and he basically made it all go away by making all these settlements, and all the details of everything that he did, including possibly doing this around the world, having recruiters recruit young girls from, Yugoslavia, all of it, most of it anyway, about 99% of it has been sealed by courts. So we're challenging with Mindy's support, which isn't, as everybody knows, which is very costly. We're challenging the court system and saying, well, wait a minute, you can't keep hiding what he did. That's essentially what's happened here. So.
And that essentially is what good newsrooms do. It's turn the problem into the story, find the systemic roadblock, and then report on that roadblock. Now, I couldn't help but notice, Jane, that there was an immediate eye contact when we said we're not done, and your eyes kind of lit up, And you looked, and I saw you looked at Julie, and it was like, sister.
I'm a big fan of Julie's reporting on this. I think they did. I think your paper did an incredible job. So, and I mean, we're not necessarily done on Kavanaugh either. So, we couldn't get some people on the record, but hope springs eternal.
Anything more you'd like to say about
No, I can't.
that? Well, we had to ask. You had it.
Oh yeah, I would just kind of love to add to
Would
this
you stand, please, and introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Shannon Lee. I contribute to Forbes.com and the Lily at the Washington Post. There's just a lot there's just a lack of, first of all, media literacy. I know because I am a survivor activist and also a journalist, and so I kind of get it from all sides. Trust me, there are so many journalists that want to tell these stories and have wanted to tell these stories. I've been writing about sexual violence since 2015, maybe before that. I was writing about Me Too before Me Too, when we could only get stories out during Sexual Assault Awareness Month and maybe Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And otherwise, the editors were not interested. So we want to tell these stories, and I think that there's just so many layers to why these things are not getting out. We don't talk about who gets to tell what stories. You know, we don't talk about whose stories editors deem worthy or the publication deems worthy, and how that kind of contributes to why certain things are not discussed. And whose stories are commissioned, and who can actually afford to work in journalism. Let's start there. You know, and really, and when we talk about trauma-informed media, you know, we're talking about who gets to write stories that concern them, and who is just given a beat, you know, and they just kind of have to take it and run with it. There's a lot of issues, and we're still dealing with, a lot of things have changed since Me Too went viral, but I think that there's still kind of like a hierarchy in terms of which stories are getting out there, so it's still going to be white cis women, that's always going to be the top, and then it kind of goes down from there. So, you know, there was a story that I had tried to get out there, and it was a story about a serial rapist. And it was the survivors that reached out to me, wanted the story to be told from their vantage point. And they had actually had a story that was going to come out, and it was packaged for TV, for CBS, and it was killed because the rapist family threatened the network with a lawsuit. But, you know, they've been trying to come out and tell their story. And they came to me, and it's kind of like, you know, we can only do so much as journalists. We will take it to them, and after Me Too broke, I thought for sure your voice would be heard. But because they were from the recovery community, so that's automatic. Oh, okay, they were addicts. Yeah. Okay, so where are our stereotypes surrounding addiction, liars, okay, not good members of the community. So there's still so much work to be done just in terms of, the context of the stories that we're telling, the framing, and also just realizing that, you know, we can turn over our work, but, you know, like I get talked to a lot about language. Okay, if I write rape and it goes to my editor and it comes out sexual misconduct, I can't help that. You know, I have told it, and I've told it from my truth, and hopefully try to represent whoever the story was about. But there's still a lot of things that they have to be careful of, or feel like they have to be careful of in terms of, you know, legal risk and things like that. So it's not just us putting it out there, and it's like, why are you creating this flowery language around what actually happened? And it's like, well, that's not what I turned in, but hopefully you were represented in that story. And just to keep in mind that, you know, there's a lot of things going on, and even just in 2019, we just had, you know, Surviving R. Kelly come out on January the 3rd.
I was closing my mouth waiting till you stop talking so I could say something to that.
You know what I'm saying? So we are, and I put something out when that came out, because I go, you know, this should be trending everywhere.
Right.
You know, there was a lot of stuff that came out. There was some things that we had problems with. There were some people that were featured in the documentary that were problematic. But the story still stands, that there was a lot of victimization. These victims wanted the story to be told from their vantage point. And why isn't this going viral everywhere? Why isn't everybody talking about this?
Well, let's let Sarah speak to that.
Yeah.
Right, and so
Thank you.
to your point,
Thank you very much.
excellent point, Shannon, and thanks for your comments. I think that, you know, as members of, and I hate to use the word mainstream media or traditional media or even emerging media, whatever terms we're going to use, but in terms of the broader media and the landscape, we have to do a better job of paying attention to truly what's emerging media, what are emerging platforms and emerging voices, because there's so many people out there at the pulse of telling some of these stories. And I think that from a newsroom perspective, the folks certainly here today that are talking about they're putting resources toward coverage. But all of us, they're all news organizations and all journalists should put more resources and even think of how whatever story that you're covering, is there a sidebar that has to do or overlaps with some of the issues that we raised. But for example, Surviving R. Kelly is something, was a passion project, or for lack of a better word, was a project by Dream Hampton, who is a producer and has a music background. So, you know, she's certainly a lot of things, and you know, but journalists in various markets that would have been able to cover R. Kelly through the trial and then the subsequent issues that we've seen over the course of time. But really, that was a watershed moment, that 3-night documentary on Lifetime. And so for the rest of us, you know, there's kind of a feeling of a media catch-up here in terms of what was covered in the documentary. And I think that's a really good moment for us, a learning moment of how there were many stories in our communities and in society at large that we probably are not spending enough time on. And so I think it's a good homework or a takeaway to go back to your newsroom and say, what is the R. Kelly moment in our community that we're not paying attention to and that we need to put some attention and resources to? But certainly want to acknowledge Dream Hampton, who again is a voice that's out there that's certainly you know, taking up media space. But I don't know that all of us, in terms of traditional media, are focused in on these really important voices out there that are trying to speak truth to power.
I absolutely agree with that. And I just wanted to jump off of what both of you are saying and point out that there are predators out there who specifically target individuals who they believe they can discredit. And they find people who you know, may come from difficult backgrounds or who struggle with addiction and things like that. And that doesn't mean that those stories aren't valid and don't deserve to be heard.
And even how we write, because the language that we use, there's a big difference between disadvantaged and addicted, right? Yeah. Go ahead, Kate McCarthy from the Women's Media Center.
Thank you. So the Women's Media Centre has been writing about sexualised violence for many, many years now, often in an international sphere. And a couple of years back in 2017, we put together our director, Lauren Wolfe, put together a list of the 5 do's and 5 don'ts. And it's not as thorough as some of the training that Zart and other people do, but it's really worth everyone taking a look at. And I will send it, Lisa, to you for your resource list.
Thank you so much. Lynn, I see you had your hand. Oh, I'm sorry, right over here, Sharif.
And as we're having this conversation, I mean, in some ways, we are forgetting about other people in our community. So there's been a couple stories by an LGBT magazine about a white Democratic donor in Los Angeles who has had 2 young black gay men dead in his house. And I've not seen any of our like mainstream or traditional media outlets covering it. It's been an LGBT magazine. And there has been coverage of Bryan Singer in Los Angeles, who is a gay man who has preyed on young gay men. But I feel like we are leaving those people out of the conversation. We're leaving people who aren't the picture perfect view of what the narrative is.
Me Too doesn't just equal white women. I mean, can we just agree to that? White women victims or even authors, we really have to break out of that thinking immediately.
Don't you think, though, that, I mean, we sort of touched on this a little bit when we talked about white patriarchy this morning. Yes. I think that we can't have this conversation without talking about how the interests of cisgendered white men dominate news and dominate this topic in particular, because there's immense doubt about what women say, not just in newsrooms. We see it in study after study after study. We see it in every single case of, whether it was Me Too or before Me Too, of a credibility gap. Women overwhelmingly believe what victims are saying, whether they're men or women. Male victims believe what victims are saying, but in general, men have a much lower rate of acceptance for what is being said, which makes sense cognitively, because to accept what women are saying is a serious threat to the systems that exist, to the patriarchy that exists. Sometimes it's dominantly white, but in the case of R. Kelly, that was not the case, right? I mean, we saw the implications of black men denying it, or black masculinity being prioritized over the safety and care of these girls. And I think that's really relevant in our newsrooms, and we have to figure out what the backlash, I believe we all encounter backlash when we raise these stories at some level or another, and we do all of the emotional labor of working around people's feelings. If I write the words white man, it is not seen as a description, it is seen as an attack. And sometimes it's seen and attacked by editors who are men, who are white, but sometimes it's seen as an attack by editors who are women and who are white, because it feels like an attack. And so having those kinds of difficult conversations, I think, are important. And what made me kind of smile this morning is we were talking about new employee orientation, because newsrooms are trying to diversify, and people coming into the newsrooms have really different experiences and needs. But in fact, I think new employee orientation should be for managers.
Right.
Not for people coming in necessarily. It should be for the people who've been there and haven't had these experiences.
Let's go to Julie and then to Lynn. Oh, I'm sorry, Maya?
Hi, Maya from National Women's Law Center. So I wanted to make a point about credibility and whose stories are deemed worthy of telling. So Jane, you made the point that it's helpful to find multiple people for a story regarding one person. And I wanted to make the point that, especially through things like the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, we hear from people who are willing to tell their story. The problem is that their harasser, the person who assaulted them, isn't famous, isn't a superstar, so it's not deemed worthy of attention. But if that person is a serial harasser, I would argue those are the kinds of stories that help demonstrate the systemic problems in particular industries and particular workplaces that are going to help us get to the structural change that we really need and that kind of reform. So I would just encourage you to be thinking about that and maybe keep an open mind as, you know, people who are dealing with these terrible problems and don't have the resources, don't have a famous harasser to help them attract attention. The other thing I wanted to say is about both leadership and this resource issue is thinking of, we've been talking a lot today about how you need leadership from the top to change organizations internally, but who are we talking about when we say leadership? What about boards? What about investors and shareholders? And how are we holding them accountable? And how are they helping or obstructing culture change? And similarly, are they helping to drive resources to tell these stories? Are they making it a priority so that you have the freedom and the resources to tell these stories?
And I'm about to call on Lynn Drin, but as we do that, let me just ask everyone in the room to start thinking now about the story idea you want to suggest, because shortly we will go into that mode, and we'd love to hear from people about the untold stories. Lynn, and then we'll go to our panel.
I actually want to bring this back in a slightly different direction and back to the thing closest to my heart, which are new employees, people just coming into the business, into the newsrooms, and especially broadcast journalists, but that also goes for print journalists who are now being tasked to carry cameras, get images, etc. There was a story over the weekend in Chico, California, where a young woman was reporting by herself, doing a stand-up about there was mass overdoses, fentanyl, etc. And some of the people around her felt that her reporting was disrespectful because of the number of people who had been impacted and had died. And she was attacked. She was out there by herself. She was attacked, and somebody in the crowd pulled the other person off her. Actually, it was a woman. These kind of attacks are happening more often, and it's part of the overall environment right now in terms of how the general public sees journalists to a certain degree. When we have 3 African-American White House reporters being vilified by the resident of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, that doesn't help. There has to be more support one way or another. We have to provide some more support for people if we want these people to stay in the business, grow to do the type of stories that we were just talking about now. Because if you're attacked doing a stand-up, you're not going to get to the point probably when you're doing the type of story that the Miami Herald did. The climate's changed, and we have to change with it and provide the support so that we can have the diversity that we want to go into the newsrooms in the future.
Thank you, Lynn. Alyssa?
I think it might be an opportune time to talk a little bit about the impact of nonprofits in this world, because in a lot of ways they are the groups that are providing some sort of support in terms of journalists being attacked. Part of what the IWF has been doing for a long time is providing hostile environments training for journalists. And granted, we've been focusing primarily on journalists who are operating in war zones, but we are going to use a significant portion of our CBS funding to provide hostile environments training to journalists in the U.S., especially in small news organizations that can't afford to provide that kind of training in recognition that the danger is everywhere. But also with regard to the types of stories that are being commissioned and being reported, grants that are available to journalists who want to cover these kinds of stories where their editors might not find the resources to cover them until there's actually something there. So we and many other organizations provide grants to cover these and other kinds of stories that are generally going untold because there isn't that appeal, there isn't that star power, et cetera. So I think that it's important for media organizations to know that there are nonprofit organizations that are supporting their operations that they can go to for these kinds of resources, be it hostile environments training, digital security training, or reporting itself. But also the funders, I think, have a lot of leverage here, and I think that they don't use it enough to make sure that the kind of communities that they're supporting through their other grants are being perpetuated and supported in the news media organizations themselves and through the reporting that's being done.
And our assignment desk team is going to take note of the IWMF training so that people will be available, they can find it there or through your website, obviously. We're going to go to Jane, we're going to go over to Julie, and then we're going to go to Indira.
I just wanted to quickly follow up on your point about involving maybe stockholders or the sort of corporate structure. If you've got a harasser who is himself not famous, I think, again, since a lot of these stories are about power, that as a reporter, it's worth taking a look at the corporate structure in which these people work. Look at who's on the board of the company. Look at the stockholders, who owns the company. Look at, there have been boycotts recently. Look at the case of Fox, where there was a $90 million settlement with a stockholder group because of the payments that Fox was paying out for harassment cases. There are a lot of ways to kind of follow the money and follow the power in these stories that are not just what happened, he said, she said. So that's all I wanted to say.
Julika.
Hi, everybody. I'm Julika Lantigua Williams from Lantigua Williams & Co. This has been the best conversation for me so far. I was in legacy media for 18 years, and a year and a half ago decided that I had fix-it fatigue. I didn't want to be the person of color coming in to save the benevolent but clueless white person. And I think that, thank you. It's my nerdy joke. But this message is for the managers and upper echelons in the room. You've got to ease up on trying to get us to fix the problem. It's the equivalent of you ramming my car and making my insurance pay for it. Right? Your insurance has to pay for it. You've got to take the initiative. It has to cost you something. And the thing that, and I'm going to tell you this because I'm outside of legacy media now, and my boss is not in the room, but you will see the heads nod. We're really tired of sitting in rooms helping people learn basic stuff that we have been applying our entire lives. And so I think, however you can figure it out, you need to give women, people of color, queer, gender fluid people a pass on some of these trainings because, frankly, we don't need them. And so with that, the second thing that I wanted to suggest was I have a company, and I have about 26 to 30 people working on projects at any point, and no one reports to anyone. And this is very intentional. I have no hierarchy. Everyone gets whatever their job is. I don't even have an assistant. I don't want any hierarchy whatsoever. And no one has to go into any space and be forced to spend time with other people. So especially for women, it's really important to have a little bit of flex time built into the job so that they don't have to be in the office 5 days a week nonstop. right? Maybe make the third week of the month, you work 2 days out in the field, or however you want to work it out. We need physical separation, especially from these legacy assholes that are never going to leave. And so for you managers, that's another option, just to say, do you want to work every other Thursday from home? That would be enough of a psychological break for us to be able to go back in and say, okay, but Thursday I'm getting my break, you know, and I'm going to file my story from home, and then I'm going to be able to go and walk my dog. And that's the sort of peace of mind that I need, because fix-it fatigue is really real. We talk about it amongst ourselves all the time, and it also detracts me from my professional development. So you are actually keeping me from exercising a huge part of my brain and my emotional wherewithal to help other people, when I really just want to be a better reporter and a better editor, and I wanted to learn to do other things. So we've got to really be honest about who needs the help here and go and help those people.
Thank you. Although I think I'd like to give you a break for work-life harmony and make sure that when you come back, there are no jerks to have a break from. Okay? All right. Indira?
Thank you so much. I'm Indira Lakshmanan. I'm the executive editor at the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, and I'm so happy to see so many friends in this room and also new faces. And I just want to, say, first of all, Jill, thank you for all the incredible work that you and Kathy have done on this in the last year, convening and keeping the focus on this issue, which is so important. I wanted to build on something Elisa said, and I'm so happy she said it, which is that nonprofit news organizations play such a crucial role, I think, in helping to fix these problems and kind of move into another stage. And I spent my entire career at legacy news organizations until quite recently. And being in the nonprofit news organization space right now, I want everyone to know we have resources. We at the Pulitzer Center, give grants to journalists to do incredible projects, whether they're freelancers or whether they're whether we partner with the organization. We also do the same HEFAT hostile environment training. We make it possible. And we're trying to, and I think it's absolutely true of IWMF and other organizations like us, we're trying to set a standard to get legacy news organizations to follow our lead in matching diversity. And one of the things that we are most concerned about is looking at diversity figures of newsrooms and trying to exceed those. So our annual report just came out today, and I'm really pleased that we looked at, okay, if 40% of the population is minority, and most newsrooms don't meet that, we have met that in terms of our grantees. This last year, half of our grantees are women, and 67% are freelancers.
We can do better, y'all.
We can do better, and we must do better. We feel like we've not done enough, but 67% freelancers also is important because so many people are being driven out of the business because of the impossibility of funding and traveling and doing the work they want to do. So, I put this out as a challenge to all of us that we go back and say, hey, if some small nonprofit news organization can do 40% minority, surely each of our newsrooms can do that and can reflect this country. So we're telling stories not just about minority America, but with the perspective of people of color and women telling those stories. And I really echo what you said, also not being relegated to certain beats or certain things, and also making sure that the people in our organizations, that we're not relying on people of color to do all the heavy lifting and all the work on diversity. Because that just becomes a second full-time job for them on top of their other duties. So try to be sensitive to that, and thank you so much for making this possible.
You just released those numbers, but you also just came on board, so we know next year is going to be better. Right? So we'll go from good to really good. All right, time to talk about story. Let's go to Hyde.
Just one comment before. I want to talk about the fix-it issue, the token African-American. I just want to say this from the perspective of being a lesbian. There's a tension between saying we want to have diversity, so we want to start bringing in people of color or LGBTQ people, right, to a place that hasn't had someone before. And then the issue of that person feeling, oh, I'm the token, or I'm being asked to carry too much. Because, that's just a straight out tension. So, to me, the issue is about the courageous, frank conversations, right? Okay, so how do we manage that? And, you know, people say that's why you need not just diversity, but also inclusion. Fine. But what does that mean in terms of the issue that you brought up? What does it mean when you say, well, I don't want to serve on the third diversity task force, and then the diversity task force is all white people, and then people say, well, where's the representation? Okay, so I think it's important for us to acknowledge, and the same thing, as I said, about being a lesbian, right? I mean, you need to be present. As a lesbian, you need to be out about it, but one has to recognize that tension. So that's the main thing I would say with respect to that. You know, let's just talk about that. The other thing I would say in terms of not needing the training, that's right, you wouldn't need some of the training. But when we're talking about respectful workplaces training, the whole point is we want to say that's separate and in addition to some of the other work. And I remember a black gay man who had been hired to do something, you know, at a gay, you know, sort of group, and then it turned out a bunch of his tweets that were really obnoxious to straight people. And I, as a lesbian, thought, that's not okay, and that probably disqualifies you for the job that you were potentially being considered for. Because the point is, you have to show that you're going to be respectful to everyone. So, those are my 2 points.
So I just heard a good story idea in there. Who has done a story on how diversity councils are created and what it's like to be a member of one? Who's done a story about how an anti-harassment task force exists in your organization and what toll it may take on the people who are on it? So we started with a couple of ideas from what Hai said. Now let's hear some ideas, either things you have done or stories you would like to see. And so I'm looking around the room, and
I have one for you.
Okay,
and there has been some coverage of the acts that were passed, I believe it was last year, in order to try to stop sex trafficking. And those have been valuable, but some communities that have been harmed by that are actually sex workers who have used the internet as a way to be more safe than they were 10 or 12 or 20 years ago, and have been able to check people out and all of that before they put themselves in potentially unsafe situations. The effect, in part of the effect of that law, has been to shut down things like Tumblr, where there have been communities that have been able to find each other and be able to check each other out and make sure those people are in more safe conditions. You heard what Craigslist had to shut down its Men for Men section, and that made sex trafficking less safe for those people and put them in more harmful situations than they can be. Now, these might not be the most sympathetic people, but in fact, that is part of the reason that we should be going out and covering these communities. They have been covered in non-mainstream publications a lot. They've been covered a little bit in mainstream publications, but I bet a lot of these people are in your communities. I go out to bars and I talk to these folks, and they are in a more dangerous situation because of the way the law has changed and the unintended consequences.
And I'd like you to step back over to Hai because I want to put her back on the spot. In the work that you've done with the task force revisited this year, you looked at other occupations, and there were some good story ideas in there where there are some efforts being made in the hospitality industry, in the restaurant industry. We want to find a camera that can see you. Make sure that everybody can see you.
Okay,
right there.
that.
Talk to that camera right there.
Okay.
And tell a little bit about, because there are great story ideas in there.
Yeah, and actually it's very easy to find all of this by just going onto the EOC website. I mean, actually just Google EOC Harassment Task Force. Don't even try to navigate our website. Just do Mama Google, and you will get right to it, and you'll see testimony of the different commission and task force meetings. But on this one, it really was trying to bring different specific industries, and I think it was called Homeroom, which I think is a great story, actually, because it's a restaurant. I think it's just like all macaroni and cheese, but it's a restaurant in Oakland. And what by engaging everyone together to come up with a solution, so I want to just respond actually just back to what I said before. I totally do not want to minimize the issue of the fix-it, because I've seen it. But it's then how do you have that conversation? So she engaged everyone in the restaurant because they were having issues of customers acting inappropriately, and the mostly female waitresses, servers, going to their mostly male managers, describing what happened, and the male managers saying, well, was that really so bad, or is that sort of diminishing? But they said, so they came up with, thank you, yellow, orange, and red. Yellow is, that just made me uncomfortable, I want to tell you, but I'm fine about still serving this table. But I can say I don't want to serve this table. Orange, it made me really uncomfortable, and then the rule is the manager starts serving the table, not her. And then red, touching in a way where the manager goes to the customer and says, please leave. And it takes the discretion away from the manager to decide whether it's orange or yellow or red.
What about the hotel workers?
And the hotel workers who, let's have a panic button, right, that we can hit if, the number of people apparently who they go into the room and the guy doesn't have anything on. And it's like, oh, good, come on in and clean. I'm just hanging around here with no clothes. So the union in Chicago started the hands off, pants on campaign. And they got an ordinance passed that actually required panic buttons
on
in
the
there.
people, not just on the carts, which is a
Right.
problem because you couldn't leave the room to get to the
To
cart
get
and
to
the
your
button.
carts. But here's the point about changing culture generally. And this got some coverage. I think it could get more. Maybe 2 months ago, a whole bunch of hotel chains, Marriott really leading the way, voluntarily said, this is what we're going to give to our workers. So sometimes you need the ordinance, and then other people can pick it up voluntarily.
Behind you, Sharif.
Hi, Linda Seabrook again from Futures Without Violence. So just to piggyback off what Hai said, we work with a coalition of organizations that are supporting women in the janitorial industry in California. It's called Ya Basta. These janitorial women are transforming their industry. And if you want to really see who has been working on culture change for quite some time, those are the stories we need to lift up. There has been some coverage of it, but it's been very limited. And it would be great to see it in a real mainstream organization to show others what has worked with people that did not have power, and how they really turned their vulnerability into power and propelled change within their industries. A coalition of Immokalee workers is another great example, and another partner of ours. They've transformed the agricultural industry in Florida. So I would look to those types of organizations. Yes, and Ya Basta testified at that last commission meeting.
Right. We're going to go over here, and then I want to make sure that people who have not yet spoken also have a chance to speak, okay? Please go ahead.
Oh, just quickly, I will just say that I've written about sexual violence and disability. I want to see more stories on that. I've written about marital rape, and I hope to see more stories on that because I got a great response, and it's happening. It's not talked about. I've written about not gendering sexual violence, and I would love to hear more about life after rape, because we are into horrifying the public without talking about life after and how we can actually uplift and empower survivors.
Alyssa, we've talked before about freelancers, and there really there are stories to be done about people who work at the discretion of others, right?
Yeah. Oh, well, there are so many stories. We have an emergency fund for women journalists, and we get, I think, one request every 72 hours. So the stories abound, but I think that what most shocks us is the volume. And so I think that most people generally just don't understand the level of sexual violence against journalists around the world. And if we have a hostile environments training and we ask for women to raise their hands who have been sexually attacked, raped, 3/4 of the women raise their hands. The women who we work with go into the field with the morning after pill. And so it's a given. And I think that that notion that sexual violence is a given in this profession is really frightening and should mortify everybody. That's why hostile environments training is so important. It's certainly not foolproof, but we do know from the people who we work with that it has helped them, really tragic stories out there. So I think just the sheer volume and the danger and the level of danger that female journalists are facing on a regular basis is a story in and of itself.
There are things people are going to take away from today that they'll remember. The idea that there are women taking the morning after pill with them on assignments because of the risk is particularly haunting.
Yeah.
I think too it's important that I think in a lot of our institutions, the environment doesn't include the online environment. There's still this wall between the virtual and the real. And because we live with these high rates of harassment and sexual violence, sexual threats, rape threats, are particularly resonant if you have either been raped, as a large percentage of people have, or have spent your life trying to avoid being raped, as every woman on the planet has.
Yes.
So I think that understanding the online as a workplace environment where the sexual threats are a form of hostile gender harassment that is effective. We know that women stop working in certain areas. They won't write on certain platforms. They'll stop writing about certain issues. They have genuine concerns and fears. And that's all important because we need safety to be paramount. But the reason we started the Speech Project is because, in fact, while safety is important, it's even, I think, more important to understand what the degradations of our freedom of expression mean for civic life and political participation and democracy. Because in the last 10 years, harassment of women, particularly marginalized women with multiple identities, trans women, black women, sex workers, it hasn't been taken seriously. And the harassment of women politicians, particularly through their pornification, isn't covered in mainstream media because we have these puritanical norms. And yet we know it's happening. Virtually any woman politician who has reached a level of seniority has been turned into porn. And that's not incidental. It degrades impressions of her as a public figure. And the same thing happens to high-profile women. And so even the difference between thinking of the shift in text to photography is important in our institutions because women are much more likely to be harassed through the use of photo manipulation, turned into pornographic objects, having, deep fake videos made of them, having their children incorporated into the pornography. That's really important to understanding why we have this hostility happening and what it means for high burnout rates, particularly among young women.
And it also requires some real editorial judgment. I can imagine, Mindy, as you're dealing with a story like that, is the focus of the story going to be on what the porn looks like, or is the focus of the story going to be on the bigger societal issue? Because there's an easy story in front of you. We all saw, the AOC manipulated photo, the fake photo that was sent around by social media. But how is it covered?
I mean, I think we just have to be mindful of that ourselves. And I think in this case specifically, I think it helps when you have, and not to say clearly that a man cannot be sensitive and as in your partner was, but I think, when you have a woman, at least somewhere in the process, either reporting or editing, and I think that helps to bring a sensitivity to it, and that's where the diversity issue, I think, really comes into it, because I think that I'm not sure that we would have gotten that. I have a lot of great investigative reporters, Julie's among the best, but I'm not sure that one of her male colleagues would have gotten this story.
So in addition to teaching at the University of Wisconsin, I run the Center for Journalism Ethics, and so I have less of a story idea and more of a call to think differently about the way you practice the journalism that you practice. I mean, a lot of what we've heard today has been busting some pretty traditional norms, the things that people always sort of rely on. Like when there's a problem, you run home to mama, and it's this code that's very locked down and tells me the ways that I should do things. And I think when you talk about trauma-informed journalism, you're thinking about a completely different way of going about the reporting. And oftentimes I'm disappointed when I go and do work in newsrooms and I hear from people that things like the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics on independence tells me that I should not do that. I should not think about that person's trauma because I don't know that that trauma ever happened and I haven't proved that. And so we come at it from this combative approach. And I think, yes, those ethics that have guided us are very, very important. I spend every minute of every day thinking about them. I'm a geek in that regard, and Jill is a fellow geek. But if we continue to use them as a shield between us and both the public we're supposed to serve and the sources we're working with, that can be highly, highly problematic. We've been doing some interesting work on sourcing, and I'll leave you with something that was really striking to me, not as striking as the morning after pill, but has really stuck with me. And that is someone who described journalism as being just like mining. It's an extractive industry. You take what you need from me and you leave me with nothing. I'm stripped. And I just found that a stunning, stunning insight. And it really changed the way I thought about how we should be approaching what we do. At the very most fundamental level, it should not be extractive. It should be productive.
Would you hand the mic to Julie, and then we'll go to Lara.
And Jill,
and then to Sarah.
I was just going to jump on that because one of the things in journalism that, you know, because I've been in the business for a long time, that I've sort of watched is when you have survivors of sexual abuse, it's always been, and even with the story to some degree, a debate on whether you call them accusers versus victims. And we had a very strenuous debate in the newsroom over this story because there was a debate whether we could use the word victims because technically the charge he pleaded guilty to was solicitation of prostitution. But we knew that these were girls who were victims because there were lawsuits that he settled, number one. There was other evidence, but still we knew that there were so many, and we really had to debate that for a while. You know, there were some people in the newsroom who felt that we should use the word accusers. I didn't feel we should use that. At one point, I got an editorial that had been written by someone at the Washington Post about the topic, and I showed it to a couple people just to sort of say, look, we got to stop this. They are survivors. They are victims. We don't have to say, you know, he did it, but we have to acknowledge that this happened. And, you know, that is a debate along the lines of, you know, journalists, we want to try to, you know, people are innocent till proven guilty, but at some point we have to recognize that victims did suffer, that, you know, they were victimized. So.
I was just going to quickly toss in an idea before handing the mic over and say that in my home state of North Carolina, there's now an effort to change the law because if you're in a same-sex couple, you can't get a restraining order against your partner. And so that speaks to whether those laws exist in other states and other localities, but it also speaks to the stereotypes, typical questions of, does a man need the protection of the law from their partner? Can a woman in a same-sex relationship or any relationship be the aggressor? We should be exploring those issues as well as the legal issues.
And just to follow up on that, for a long time they used to refer to alleged victims, right. Which now there's some conversation about just victims. And so I wanted to talk about this idea. I wish we had a color for this movement because I would refer to it as the greenwashing of whatever this color is, the purple washing of the culture shift, which is companies now coming out and taking on a stand. The hotel worker, panic worker button made me think about it because a bunch of hotels did come out in September and say we're going to commit to providing panic worker buttons at some later date, at some later time, in some vague way. There was good coverage around that, but the panic worker button alone doesn't make any sense if you don't have any mechanism in the hotel to answer the call, and that when the call is answered and an assault is discovered, that the hotel backs up the employee in the legal case against that, right? Those are the two pieces that make all the difference. So it's important that your assault be interrupted, that the panic worker button helps you on that, but it doesn't do any good if there isn't the additional commitment to backing them up in a court of law and backing them up in the sort of HR process in that way. And you haven't seen that in any of these companies. And so I think there's potentially also a line of like, how great is it that all these hotels came together and their support panic worker buttons with sort of the purple washing of that, which is that what that covers is it's really popular right now to be against sexual harassment and assault as a company. It's a good thing to try to get ahead of. But what you have to do is sort of dig down deeper and continue to do the follow-up reporting that holds their feet to the fire.
It's a reminder of the, truly of the role of all of us as critical thinkers and the editors who partner with reporters on saying what else is not involved in this story. This was the good headline, and we gave that to the people who made the announcement, but let's go deeper into the process of what happens next, and how much does it cost, and what other investment is involved, and how, by the way, would you track the people who are potentially repeat offenders, even if they're not rapists, but they're offensive clients and customers. Those kinds of questions are the things that sometimes get lost in the conversation around, look at the new thing they've done. Sarah, I'm sorry, you were up.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to acknowledge Katie, I believe, from the University of Wisconsin, right? An ethics expert.
Go Badgers.
Yes, go Badgers. Just wanted to really piggyback and acknowledge what you said about, really struck a chord with me in terms of, like, the future of journalism is doing things differently, and sometimes the reporting on systematic change has to be internal to our profession. So the thing that struck the chord is when you talked about, codes of ethics. We can call it any organization in terms of, organizations have codes of ethics and the way to do journalism, and we often use that as this shield, paraphrasing you, as to why we would cover something the way we cover it. And I just really wanted to share with everyone an example of something that I just did as one little individual, one little Sarah Glover from Western Pennsylvania, and I made a difference, I hope, in that Freddie Gray, when he was killed suddenly, and the protests ensued just down the street in Baltimore, there was an incident one day that a woman, quote unquote, was beating a boy. Woman beats boy, or something to that effect was the headline that came across AP, and it was pretty much instantaneous as the protest was happening. So as people were reporting that story, it was the visuals and the video of that protest that struck a chord with people. So I think every news outlet in the country wanted to know, like, who was the boy, who was the woman, and it took, I think, probably an hour to two or more till the story really developed that it was a mother going to the scene to get her teenage son out of the protest because she was worried about his, being a part of potentially violence or demise, et cetera, et cetera. And so I remember when that came across the wire, and I immediately, physically stood up and said, wait, before we hit publish on that, let's think about what that headline looks like. Because for me, as a mother of a black male who's now 22, that word boy evokes very negative historical context and meaning. And so, and I've tried to talk about this not just with NABJ, but with other journalists, that we have to be so very careful of language. So as you all also mentioned the word accused. But what happens is sometimes as journalists, we then go to the AP style book, which we love the AP style book. I use the AP style book. It is a Bible of sorts, but it also is a guide. It's a book. It's something that we should, it should be like a breathing document, I feel like, as journalists. It's a part of our toolkit. It's not the only toolkit, but piece of our toolkit. But when you go to the definition of boy, what is that say? And so for many newsrooms, that headline would have been adequate or appropriate. To me, it was very inappropriate and hurtful and demeaning and even racist, if you will. So just to have that conversation and to have someone say to me, well, the AP style book, da-da-da-da-da, and have other journalists in different journalist circles, kind of defend that use of that headline on that day in that moment. And so I said, okay, fine. I wasn't going to go back and forth with those persons that I know throughout the media industry. It was in various conversations with various people, I was getting the same kind of reaction. So I just said, you know what, I'm just going to call AP, or I'm going to reach out to AP. So I found the editor, one of the editors at AP that deals with style, and reached out to him, and he was more than open and willing to talk to me. So it was a one-on-one conversation that ended up going over the course of 6 months. And there was a change at the end of last year. In the 2018 AP style book, there is a new definition of the word boy, and it includes the nuance of how we describe black men, or to think about the descriptions of black men. So I really encourage journalists and organizations, like, you know, for NABJ, advocacy is a part of what we do. And I know that different organizations have different modes and methods for advocacy, but you as an individual journalist can just go up and call someone and ask a question, and it can make a change that can have an impact, because I can only imagine the number of subscribers around the world that picked up that Wire story, or that picked up stories, not just from AP, but from other organizations that AP might put on their Wire. And I think that that's some of the way that you can have an impact. But don't just take what someone says as, this is the way it is, this is the shield of journalism, this is the Bible of journalism. We're all people, you know, and sometimes if it doesn't feel right, it ain't right, or if it doesn't smell right, use your spidey senses, just like you do to do the story, and just have at it. But I think, you know, just having respectable conversations with stakeholders, people are always open to hearing, you know, how can we do this thing called journalism better as we continue to go forward. And certainly that editors reached out to us for other things, and I think there might be some other things that we'll contribute to in the style book. But we have to have these conversations, and it should be a part of not just you trying to tell that story, but, you know, follow through and do something about it. If you know, have an extra hour on your hands, you can call AP or call any other organization and have a conversation about it.
Yeah, I think Jill's PowerShift training, one of the most fantastic parts of it is the courageous conversations. Those don't just have to be about harassment; they need to be about the journalism too. And that's just that warms my heart. That story. Thank you.
We want to go over to Canada.
Yay.
All right.
I could just say
Okay.
the snow didn't scare me. I'll just say that. I laughed. Hi, I'm Sandra Porches from Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. I have a lot of good friends
Play to
in
that
this room.
camera, please.
Oh, play to the camera.
Yep.
Will I have a talk show by the end of today? Maybe not on CBC. I hold a really unusual role at CBC, as Jill knows. I'm the first ever director of engagement, which is all about job satisfaction for our employees, which are working from coast to coast to coast in radio, TV, and digital. And then somebody got the idea that after 75 years, we really ought to fix some of the issues around diversity. So first we stopped calling it diversity and called it inclusion, because it's not about diversity, it's about getting leaders and diverse employees into key roles. And then we started talking about, you know, it's not inclusion anymore, it's human equity. And that's the journey we're on. We're on a journey towards human equity. And I'm going to tell you this, the reason it's working for us in these early days, I'm a year and a half into this job, and our stats each quarter for diversity of new hires are the highest they've been in 75 years. And people keep writing me going, this might be working. After 18 months, and of course the 75 years where we meant to do this, the intentions were great. But to the fix-it fatigue, love this line. Because when I took the job, I mean, I have diverse family members, so I'm lazy. I went to them first. My daughter-in-law is Indigenous. My son-in-law's family's from the Caribbean, so he's a black Nova Scotian. And I said, what do you think? And they said, stop talking about the diversity problem. Can you just do something? So I said to my colleagues, we're not talking anymore. So action, action, action. In fact, Keith Woods came to talk to the senior leaders of our company not long ago, but it actually might be working, and here's why. Because what we said is, what is the problem we're trying to solve in Canada? Are we reflecting our audience in all its richness and diversity? We've always had gender parity. We've always had 50% women, 50% men. We have our first ever female president of the CBC. So I, as a feminist, worked in newsrooms where I had very, I think, daily battles against sexist colleagues who would say to me, you would probably prefer drama or a food program. There's other jobs you can do within the company. I said, no, I'm staying in news. But that was tough. So I made the mistake as a senior leader of my organization of thinking the problem was fixed because it looked a little better in news. I didn't look to my left or right to ask who wasn't hired. We have almost no persons with disabilities. We had very few diverse leaders, lots of diverse junior people from 3 groups that we measure: Indigenous, persons with disabilities, and visible minorities. Our LGBTQ numbers are very high. So what we've done at the CBC, and I throw this out to you as a challenge in your organizations, because it's not like we're getting it all right, trust me. But what we did is we came up with a new approach: is what is the problem we're trying to solve? So people came up to me, my white colleagues, and they said, we would love to hire a diverse leader in Edmonton if only we could find one. Okay. We would love to hire a diverse exec producer of a radio show if only we could find one. And I said, you can't find them? So I partnered with a friend of mine. Jill's been involved in the program, Keith Woods, Ms. Stewart. We'll take top trainers from any country, by the way. And what we did is we said we're going to fast track 16 people a year, give you the best leadership training you've ever had, and then we're going to track you. We're going to fast track you. When people say to me, if only I could, I go, I've got 15. As of last week, I have 30. I have 60 more arriving in March. The competition, again, in the course, as Jill knows, is tough. 166 to 200 people apply for 16 spots. The first year, people said, weeping, I can't believe I didn't get in. Oh, no, I said, it's going to keep running. So check us out, cbc.ca. We have a new 3-year plan. And the last thing I'll say, action, action, action. Persons with disabilities, we launch paid placements. You know, you want to have people in your company who don't look like the typical employee. You can come up with actions. And the last thing I'll say is we just had a slogan we've just beat into everybody's heads. And one of my managers said, the only reason this is working, because you're not going to stop talking until they do it. And I said, it's actually, my husband says it's a really good, yeah, it works with the garbage. So I will tell you this, you know, are you reflecting your audience in all its richness and diversity? If you're not, the CBC should be shut down, because it's public money. So I would go back to your town. We used the census this year. We walked in every station with a new book called Canada Today. Here's Winnipeg. I don't think Winnipeg's diverse. Well, no, that's because you're white and you go to a white church and your kids are in a white school. But once we give them the census, it's a wake-up call. They look at these stats. So I would just encourage you, I really mean it, please look at the cbc.ca 3-year plan and get in touch with us. And I repeat, trust me, we are not getting it right in every part of the country and for every employee. But I just would say to the Fix-It fatigue, thank you for reminding me of that. It's not about forming a committee. It's about taking actions that prove to your employees you're taking this damn seriously.
And if I might just pile on, I've said, you know, obviously I work at the Miami Herald, and, you know, we're probably, 20, 30 years ahead of what's happening around the country right now. And so I like to say often that I'm in the position I am right now because somebody had the foresight to hire me 30 years ago, right, into as a young reporter right out of college. And they didn't do it because there were, it was charity. It was just make smart business sense because they saw what was happening. And by the way, at that time, we were probably 15 years late to the party to actually hire, bilingual, Spanish-speaking, Creole-speaking reporters, et cetera. But, if we don't want to cover our community like a foreign correspondent, just landing in some exotic locale and discovering the natives. And that's what we always see when people come to Miami, that crazy wild place, and try to cover us, from a different perspective. So it makes business sense to do that. It's not a favor. It's not because you're trying to fill a quota. It's just smart. We would have missed key stories if we didn't have reporters who understood certain nuances about their community, cultural, ethnic, et cetera. And so I just feel like it's just absolutely a smart thing to do.
Sure.
I have a story idea for someone. This isn't something that I necessarily could do in my newsroom, so if anybody else is open to doing this, we're talking about the idea of abuse and harassment and covering that. And one group of people that get entirely left out of the conversation, at least right now in the work that we're doing, are childhood abuse survivors. So people who are abused by their parents. It's a difficult narrative to navigate because the problem is that they're children, and so typically we need permission to get from their parents. And it's also difficult because it's not typically a serial abuse situation. It's one child or it's 2 children, but they're not going to go abuse somebody else's children, more likely than not. But there is kind of the systemic issue of child protective services and how they respond to these kinds of issues of childhood abuse. And there was also a really interesting story that BuzzFeed News did. They've done a couple stories about this, about financial abuse and parents taking their children's social security numbers and opening credit cards in their name and hurting their potential financial credit future. I'm actually a childhood abuse survivor and a financial abuse survivor. I moved out of my parents' house, my parent house, when I was 14, moved in with the other parent and survived that. But the problem that I see is that we don't talk to these people, and there are adulthood, childhood abuse survivors who have gone through therapy and are willing to talk about it. And I think that's the place where we could maybe look at it is, I'm pretty sure somebody called Child Protective Services when I was in elementary, middle school, and I don't know what happened with that, but
Thank you, Sharon.
that's an issue that I think we should, as an industry, be focusing on more.
Thank you for your candor.
Hi, I'm Donna Line-Wanleje with DC Media Strategies, former Miami Herald reporter. Hi, Mindy. And former USA Today editor. So I tried, but I couldn't find. I tried, but I couldn't find. I hear this all the time. I tried, but I couldn't find a woman for a panel. So the story idea that I have for you is a story idea about corporate America. This goes back to that hotel idea. We cover a lot of, business reporters cover a lot of stories about people launching initiatives. And then they say that they're going to have a diversity, and we're very hard on ourselves about getting diversity in the business, as Sandra was talking about. But we need to go out and demand that we find out from the people that we cover, what does it mean when you say you tried? How hard did you try? And I think that's a story we should always be doing when we are talking to corporations. You have this initiatives, what did you do and why did you fail?
Okay. As we're in the last few minutes, and we're shortly going to wrap up, I really want to go back to our conversation leaders to think about this assignment desk concept. If you're thinking about the stories that are still to be told, that you feel maybe we've touched on them, dig deep and tell us, in your dreams, what would we be covering?
Well, there's one issue that I've been grappling with for a couple of years now that came out of the issues that are being dealt with in the photojournalism community, where harassment and abuse are potentially even more severe than in the regular mainstream journalism community, because the inequity, the gender inequity in photojournalism is so much greater. The competition is great, and they're also often working in really dangerous environments, which leads to all kinds of abuses as well. But what has struck me recently is that the actions that women in the photojournalism industry have taken to try to protect themselves in terms of creating some sort of whisper network have been met with a lot of backlash. And so an interesting story that I find is the attack on the attempts to protect yourself and to develop systems of protection around journalists who are daring enough to come forward and then are being attacked by their industry, their colleagues, their female colleagues, as well as their male colleagues, because it is just viewed as somehow making it harder for everybody. It's hard enough to be a photojournalist, why do you have to go there? But the notion that's one piece of this, but this piece of the whisper network and the issues that came out after the shitty men in media list and the legal threats against the person who developed that list that was meant to be a private list, by the way, was never meant to be public. This difficulty in actually calling men on their behavior without the backlash, or being able to have that conversation where you're actually identifying perpetrators in a way that doesn't put you at risk, either in your own place of employment or legally, if the word gets out that you have made some spurious comment. And I really felt this in the aftermath of the Kavanaugh hearings, this backlash. So, well, he fought it so hard, that's the way to do it. We're just going to fight back twice as hard as we did before. And I found that really, really frightening.
Okay. Jay?
I don't know, I'm just picking up on what you were saying about the Kavanaugh story. One of the things that interested me was it seemed entirely possible to me that what Christine Blasey Ford had accused him of, he had done. And it's interesting to me, I think he could have, instead of fighting back doubly hard, might have said, I was a high school kid, I was stupid, I've grown up, I'm more sophisticated now, I've got a wife and daughters. Why is there not that possibility open in politics for people to tell the truth about things they did wrong without, and there be some space in the public dialogue for for someone to survive that situation politically. I mean, I would have had so much more respect for him if he had told the truth. I think it's, as I saw it, just the problem was seeing someone who I felt was not telling the truth, who's about to be on our highest court. So I think this, you know, I'm also interested in I mean, while I've, you know, been writing about the women in these situations a lot, you know, I think there is a rush to judgment, and there's sometimes trial by internet in some of these cases. I was interested in the Al Franken situation where there was no process. He was out of there overnight. Yeah. I'm interested in a story about, well, what would his trial look like? And you know, is there due process? And are people, is it fair for both genders? So I don't know. I have a lot of questions about this. But.
Mindy?
Yeah, I think the dream story is Julie's follow-up, but I'm sure that's going to come. I'm actually really interested. I think that there's probably an untold story about this issue in terms of Spanish language media that really probably needs to be explored. I've heard, you know, being in Miami, it's the seat of Spanish language media, major networks, and I believe that we've heard some tips, but nothing that, I think there's more there, and it's probably given the Latin machismo, et cetera, that probably needs to be explored.
Soraya?
I think that well, I'm 52, and I remember my first women's studies classes had everything to do with intersectionality, and it informs my work. And over again, I encounter headlines and stories and editors too who don't reflect that complexity. And in virtually every type of hate or violence that we write about, the violence is intersectional. And so when we write about white supremacy, it really should be about white male supremacy, because you can't, you know, white supremacy doesn't exist without the quality of this intense gender-based violence that's happening at intimate levels in the home. And if you don't understand the levels of violence, you really aren't going to address the root causes or change public knowledge. And the story that I would like to suggest is about how we think about and evaluate hate crimes. Why do we have hate crimes? They're a symbolic gesture, really. And if we're going to have hate crimes, what do we say when we recognize them? Because I have spoken to the Department of Justice, and I've spoken to the Southern Poverty Law Center, and for several years now have asked, okay, if you're looking at anti-Semitism, if you're looking at racism, if you're looking at homophobia, why are you not looking at the intersections of that with misogyny? Because women who are Jewish, women who are black, women who are LGBTQ, they are experiencing higher rates of violence all the time. And over again, I see in headlines the erasure of that dimension. And so I would urge people to think about what that means.
All right. You get the last word before I go to Kathy. And Kathy, the director, said he'd like us to be right there at the assignment desk. So last word on story ideas.
Thank you, Jill. So wanted to at least comment and mention Tarana Burke, founder of Me Too, as well as the brave women in Press Forward who came forward to found that organization. Can't have this conversation without acknowledging them. And I think that, you know, from all the themes we spoke about today, it still resonates with me, victims who are women of color. Those stories are not being told, and incidents of violence and inequality, whether it be from a power standpoint, economic standpoint, is happening systemically in communities of color that's not only impacting people by the fact that they're female, but it's impacting their families and their communities, because oftentimes women of color are the sole breadwinners in the family. So this is having a systemic impact on what does the black family look like, you know, in the future, and what do Latino and Hispanic families look like, and Asian families. So I'd like to challenge folks today to follow up on those stories, and then also like to throw out there, which I already threw out to Jill, that hopefully we'll be able to work with the Power Shift Summit on convening a group of women of color in particular to help, you know, help find ways to have these stories told. We'd love to have, the folks in this room as well, or representatives from news organizations, but to hear from women of color journalists and stakeholders, because I think that we haven't even scratched the surface, and the issues that are there, there's still a barrier for women of color to find their truth because they're afraid to talk about it. When I say afraid, it's not because they have fear, it's because there are not the pathways for their stories to be told. So we have to work on creating those pathways and empowering women so that they can be who they really are. So I look forward to following up and working with the journalists of color organizations to hopefully that'll happen in the spring. So I'm challenging us to make
on
that
the
happen.
record. Right.
On the record.
Before we thank our conversation leaders and everyone else in the room, while we all go back to our own respective lives, Kathy keeps working on this here at the Freedom Forum Institute, and she took a lot of notes. Oh, there's a picture of your granddaughter, though.
Well, thanks,
what else
Jill.
you got?
Amelia, she's very nice.
So what did you hear?
Yeah, so first of all, and Jane, you're on deadline. You should go. We should let one of our conversation leaders.
Thank you. I was just going to say one other thing.
Okay.
Use your mic.
It was just that I had a great conversation with Anita Hill, whose story I covered so many years ago recently, and she was saying, apropos of the Harvey Weinstein story, it shouldn't have to take Gwyneth Paltrow to make people believe a woman, and that for every Gwyneth Paltrow, there's so many women who have these stories, who in every level of American society and probably global society. So we need to know about all the people who are not famous, incredibly rich, incredibly beautiful, and have all the power already, basically. So, but anyway, thank you. Thank you.
So I'm just going to say that honestly, I was worried that this year's version of the Power Shift Summit wasn't going to be as powerful and as thoughtful and as remarkable as the first. And it exceeded, I think, in many ways, the first conversation we had. They were very different conversations. But this one truly has been astounding, and there is no way I can sum up what just happened in this room since 9 o'clock this morning. But with the help of our assignment desk, some of the key themes, and let me try to read off my phone, and this was a thought that someone said, last year we were all working on raising awareness. It was a big moment. All year long we've worked on fixing things. Today we talked about solutions and some of the strategies and the tools that we've developed. But we also discussed how profound and deep these culture issues are and how profound and deep our commitment must be to changing the status quo. Lauren Williams of Vox raised the issue of pathways, and Carolyn Ryan summed it up this way. When you start talking about sexual harassment and mistreatment in the workplace, it always comes back to something more profound. Do people feel like they have a place here? Do they have a path? That, to me, is the essence of why this matters. Who is the system set up to nurture, and who has been left to find their way? And all of that intersects with the bigger question of mistreatment and misconduct. So I think that, and so many people circled that thought today. A few other themes really quickly. There absolutely has been progress. We have a new intentionality about creating the culture we want to have, not just checking boxes, like Tracy said, because we need to do it legally. There's been more attention to diversity, though not enough, and why it's important. There's more and sometimes uncomfortable efforts at transparency, but there's still a reluctance that's holding us back. Organizations that fear participating in surveys are looking at their own house in honest ways, even anonymously. And there's still not enough women in diverse representation at all levels. How long have we been saying that? I covered these issues 30 years ago for the Wall Street Journal, or 20, I can't remember, and pipeline, it's coming your way, stay tuned. It's been a really long time. Sarah Glover noted change has not been drastic enough. She issued a call to action. We all have to put pressure on our organizations to say, where's the change? And there are new challenges, particularly around safety issues. This was so fascinating, the inherent conflict between the need to promote our work and building a journalist brand and exposing that person to online harassment or threats, or as Elisa said, let's call it what it is, online attacks. And while we can look to improve safety in our own newsrooms, how do we protect people remotely who work in foreign countries, who work in different cultures, or even safety around powerful sources and others critical to our work? And we still work against our own culture of toughing it out. From the EEOC, we heard that there's a wealth of resources and information in their landmark report that can help shift us from being reactive to being proactive. We need to look at risk factors in our own workplaces. We need to set clear expectations and clear, fair measures for those who fail them. Our story session, I can't even begin to sum up how rich this past session was, but there are countless stories to be told, even the stories that already have been told that can be told in a much better, richer way that look at systemic failures like we saw in Miami. But great journalism takes time and money. Don't assume there are no resources to get a great story told. There are untapped resources, nonprofits with funds. Understand that when dealing with people in trauma, we can and should approach reporting in new ways. Getting our own training and considering new approaches in language makes a difference. I'm going to turn this over to Jill, but I just want to say that, you know, the best way that you can keep up with the real work that came out of this room today is to follow us at PowerShift Pro on Twitter, or to follow us on the web, because we will be creating a major report from this day. We will be following up with lots of resources on an assignment desk resource page, and all of those will be made available really soon. And I will turn to Jill now to talk about.
Hold that, I got one.
Oh, you got one, I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. That was a great summary. We covered a lot of ground. My gosh, thanks to the desk. By the way, Sonia, Roseanne, Karen, Lisa from the assignment desk have live blogged, and they're putting the resource list together, and so they really did the hard work. Last word. Convening is great, but there's a letdown. There's sort of a postpartum depression after these things where we leave and go, yeah, we were all in it together, and how can we make other people feel this way when they're in the room with us in the future? Are there more like us at home? Yeah, there probably are, but how do we have those conversations? The last time we did this, we immediately jumped into the first project, which was interns, because they were the most vulnerable. That was the thing that we heard in the room. And then immediately after that, to create the cultural approach. How do we change cultures? Because we heard that from you. That leads me to say, great, we created it, and now we want to make sure people can take advantage of it. And you know, now that we have the resources, put the list up, because I do want to tell you very specifically, the workplace integrity training, it's a 2-day training. If you work in a media organization, and you are empowered to go back and deliver training in your organization. And that's really all we ask, that you got to be in one of those, those qualifications. We will train you, and you will leave with a complete kit of resources, and you'll be stuck with us for life. Right? Because people will call and ask us for, for help. We are going to do a new release of the training in June, where we will add some case studies for universities. I used that training in a power and gender class, broke it up into 3 pieces, and used it in an academic setting. So there are other ways that you can use it. Those are the trainings. All you have to do is go online and do it, and we have a lot of fun. And the next thing we'll do is take a look at the individual level. The next things we develop for training will be about how we can, as individuals, do better. That's a work in progress. We're going to have it informed by many voices, especially voices from the minority journalism community. So there's work to be done, and the power shift remains on the case.
But I get the last word, actually,
That's
because I want to thank everyone who took the time to come here today. I want to thank the incredible Museum and Freedom Forum Institute staff who came in yesterday when we technically
Use
were
your
closed. When we were technically closed due to weather, and who came in yesterday and this morning, even on a 2-hour delay, to support this event. Thanks to our leadership, Jan Newharth and Jean Polisinski. Thanks to our assignment desk editors, Karen Testa and Lisa Shepard, our live blogger, Roseanne St. Aubin. Thanks to the production and tech crew today and the people who provided our meals. Thanks to all the conversation leaders, to our advisors, and most of all, to Jill Geisler. Thank you so much.